The great hall of the onyx throne was a cavern of calculated silence. Not the peaceful quiet of a library, nor the reverent hush of a cathedral, but the dense, watchful stillness of predators at rest. Here, sound was currency. A courtier's whisper could purchase a rival's ruin, the rustle of a silken gown could signal an alliance, and the king's low murmur was law absolute. Ilara had learned the acoustics of power in her 3 years serving the royal household. She knew the way laughter, thin and brittle, never quite reached the vaulted, shadow-eaten ceiling. She knew the sound of a heavy goblet set upon an oak table could be a declaration of war. She moved through these currents of unspoken meaning like a skiff on a treacherous sea, her presence intended to be as unnoticed as the air itself. Her job was one of ghosts, to refill a glass before it was empty, to clear a plate the moment a fork was laid to rest, to be a pair of hands without a face, a function without a history. It was a role she performed with a quiet diligence that kept her employed and, more importantly, safe. The court of the vampire king, Theron, was no place for notice. Notice was a prelude to scrutiny, and scrutiny was a prelude to destruction. Tonight, the hall was saturated with the scent of mulled blood wine, beeswax, and the cold, mineral tang of ancient stone. A fire roared in the hearth at the far end of the room, its light catching on the crimson banners that hung from the rafters, each bearing the sigil of the obsidian bat. The long tables were filled with the kingdom's elite, ancient vampires with skin like polished marble and eyes that held the coldness of distant stars, their movements fluid and economical, their faces masks of aristocratic boredom. They were beautiful and terrifying, and Ilara kept her gaze fixed on the level of the wine in their goblets, on the polished floor, on anything but their eyes. But her attention, disciplined as it was, always snagged on the one patch of stillness within the greater, predatory quiet. At the high table, to the right of the king's immense, throne-like chair, sat Prince Sorellen. He was the hole in the tapestry of the court, the silent note in their lethal symphony. Where his father, King Theron, was a monolith of presence, broad-shouldered, sharp-edged, his every breath seeming to draw the room's attention, Sorellen was an exercise in absence. He was handsome in a way that seemed accidental, with the same raven-dark hair as the king and a finely structured face that, in another life, might have been prone to easy smiles. But his features were locked in a mask of placid neutrality, his gaze often distant, fixed on the patterns of torchlight dancing on the stone walls. He was the king's only son, the heir to the onyx throne, and he had never spoken a word in his life. The courtiers had, over the years, perfected the art of ignoring him. They treated the space around him as a vacuum. Conversations flowed around his chair as if it were an empty seat, their gazes sliding past him without purchase. They would address the king, even turning their backs partially on the prince to do so. It was a cruelty so practiced it had become a form of etiquette. To acknowledge the mute prince was to acknowledge the king's perceived failing, the one imperfection in a bloodline that prided itself on dominance. And so, Sorellen sat, night after night, in a fortress of solitude built by the fear and ambition of others. Ilara watched it happen in stolen glances. She saw the way a duchess, gesturing extravagantly with a wine glass, would angle her body just so, creating a physical barrier between herself and the prince. She saw how a visiting lord, when addressed by the king, would direct his answer solely to the monarch, his eyes refusing to even flicker toward the silent figure beside him. They did not mock him outright. That would be a foolish provocation of the king. Instead, they erased him with 1,000 tiny, bloodless cuts of disregard. Tonight, the dismissal was particularly sharp. A titter of laughter, rare and dangerous, rippled down from the high table. Lord Valerus, a vampire whose ambition was as sharp and obvious as his pointed canines, was holding court, regaling the king with a story of some border skirmish. His voice, slick and confident, filled the space. As he reached his punchline, he made a grand, sweeping gesture with his hand, a flourish of performative victory. The gesture, perhaps intentionally, perhaps not, passed directly before Sorellen's face, close enough to make a lesser man flinch. Sorellen did not flinch. He did not move at all. He simply sat there, his hands resting in his lap, his expression unchanged. But Ilara, refilling a goblet a few feet away, saw it. She saw the subtle tightening of the muscles along his jaw, the barest flicker of his eyelids. It was a minuscule crack in the marble facade, a momentary betrayal of the hurt that must lie beneath. In that instant, he was not the mute prince, an abstract symbol of dynastic flaw. He was a young man, alone in a room full of people, being treated like a piece of furniture. A familiar ache bloomed in Ilara's chest, a ghost of an old sorrow. It was the memory of her younger brother, Leo, a boy born into a world of silence he could never hear, his hands his only voice. She remembered the other children in their village, the way they would stop talking when he approached, the way they would stare at his flying fingers with a mixture of fear and fascination, never understanding. She remembered the loneliness in his eyes, a loneliness that looked so very much like the one she saw in the prince's. Lord Valerus finished his story to appreciative murmurs. The king offered a thin, regal smile. The moment passed. The world moved on, leaving Prince Sorellen once more adrift in his soundless sea. Ilara's fingers tightened on the heavy pitcher in her hand. The polished silver felt cold against her skin. An idea, reckless and terrifying, began to form in the quietest corners of her mind. It was a foolish, dangerous impulse, a violation of the primary rule of her existence here: do not be seen. But the image of the Lord's hand slicing through the air in front of the prince's face, and the ghost of her brother's lonely eyes, conspired against her caution. She took a steadying breath, the air tasting of wine and regret yet to be borne. She knew what she was about to do could cost her everything. The feast wore on, a slow, deliberate procession of courses and conversations. Ilara moved with the rhythm of her duties, her mind a storm of debate. The risk was immense. At best, she would be dismissed, her livelihood gone. At worst, well, the dungeons of the Onyx Throne were not just a rumor. But every time she glanced toward the high table, she saw him a portrait of isolation. He ate with a slow, mechanical grace, his eyes never meeting anyone's. He was a prince, a creature of immense power by birthright, yet he was the most powerless person in the room. The memory of Leo's hands was what decided it. Leo, who had taught her that silence was not emptiness. He had shown her that a whole world of language could exist in the curve of a finger, the flick of a wrist. He had taught her to listen with her eyes. To ignore the prince now felt like a betrayal of her brother, a betrayal of the fundamental truth he had embodied, that everyone deserves to be heard, one way or another. Her opportunity came near the end of the meal, when the dessert course was being cleared and the courtiers were lapsing into the languid, wine-heavy conversations that preceded the night's end. The king was momentarily distracted, deep in a low-voiced discussion with his seneschal. The other nobles were focused on their own intrigues. For a brief span of seconds, Prince Sorellen was, as usual, entirely unobserved. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum against the hall's oppressive silence. She approached the high table on the pretense of clearing the prince's plate. Her movements were practiced, smooth, designed to be invisible. She reached for his silver dish, her body angled to shield her actions from the rest of the room. Her shadow fell over his hands, which were resting, palms down, on the dark wood of the table. He did not look up. He likely expected her to be as silent and ephemeral as every other servant. With her back to the court, her face a mask of professional vacancy, she took the risk. It was a small, fleeting movement of her free hand, the one not holding the plate. Just 4 fingers, tucked against her palm, her thumb tracing a slow, deliberate circle on her chest. A simple, foundational sign. The one Leo used to use when he was feeling overwhelmed, a quiet plea. "Are you all right?" She held the sign for only a heartbeat, a secret whispered in a language of touch and air. Then, her hand returned to the plate, her task complete. She straightened up, expecting nothing. It was a message in a bottle thrown into a silent ocean. She had done it, and now the terror, cold and sharp, set in. She turned to leave, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. But then, a flicker of movement at the edge of her vision made her pause. Prince Sorellen's head had lifted. Just an inch. His eyes, dark and startlingly intense, were no longer fixed on some distant point. They were fixed on her. For the first time, Ilara found herself the subject of his full, undivided attention. There was no recognition in his expression, not yet. There was only a profound, bottomless shock. It was the look of a man who had been sitting in a dark room his entire life and had just seen someone strike a match. The world, for that one suspended moment, held its breath. And in the prince's stunned, silent gaze, Elara saw the terrifying, thrilling confirmation that her message had been received. The moment stretched, thin and taut as a wire. Sorellen's eyes, the color of a starless midnight sky, held hers. The shock in them was slowly being replaced by something else, something sharper and more complex, a dawning, incredulous question. Elara's blood ran cold. She had overstepped. She had broken the unspoken law of this place, which was to pretend the prince was a phantom. Now, the phantom was looking right at her, seeing her, and his gaze felt like a physical weight. Her training, her instinct for survival, screamed at her to break eye contact, to turn and melt back into the shadows from which she had emerged. She was a servant. She was nothing. She had no right to pierce the veil of his isolation. But she couldn't look away. Trapped in his stare, she saw not the anger of a prince whose privacy had been violated, but the stunned vulnerability of a man who had just heard his native tongue spoken in a foreign land after a lifetime of exile. King Theron's voice, a low rumble from down the table, broke the spell. Sorellen, it was not a question, but a command for attention that expected no reply. Instantly, the prince's mask of placid indifference snapped back into place. His gaze dropped from hers to the table before him. The crack in the marble was sealed. The brief, intense connection was severed. He was once again the silent, ornamental son. But something had changed. Elara could feel it. As she turned, her heart a wild bird in her chest, and walked away from the high table, she could feel his awareness following her. It was no longer the passive, unfocused gaze of before. It was a targeted, questioning presence at her back. She spent the rest of the evening in a state of high alert, every nerve ending tingling with a mixture of fear and a strange, triumphant hope. She moved through her duties on autopilot, her hands steady while her mind reeled. Had anyone else seen? Lord Valerus's sharp eye seemed to be everywhere. The king's seneschal, a withered ancient with a mind like a steel trap, missed nothing. She risked a glance back at the high table. The king was watching his son with a faint, almost imperceptible frown, as if noticing a subtle shift in the composition of a familiar painting. Sorellen, for his part, remained perfectly still, his gaze once more distant. But Elara knew it was a performance now. He was aware of her. The hours crawled by. Finally, the king rose, signaling the end of the evening. The court rose with him, a rustle of silk and a soft scrape of chairs against stone. As the nobles began to disperse, filing out of the great hall in a slow, elegant procession, Elara busied herself with collecting empty goblets, trying to make herself as small and insignificant as possible. She was stacking glasses on her tray when a page, a young boy with nervous eyes, approached her. "The prince," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "He requires a pitcher of water in his chambers." Elara's breath caught. It was a simple, mundane request. But it had never happened before. The prince's personal servants attended to his needs in his private wing. A serving girl from the great hall would never be summoned. This was not a request for water. It was a summons. Of course, she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. The walk to the royal wing was a journey into the heart of her fear. The corridors grew quieter, the tapestries on the walls more ancient and elaborate. The guards standing sentinel outside the prince's chambers were monoliths of sculpted steel and shadow, their faces hidden behind visored helms. They did not challenge her, merely watched her pass with an unnerving stillness. The page opened the heavy oak door for her and then vanished, leaving her alone on the threshold. The prince's chambers were vast and silent, dominated by a cold, unlit fireplace and towering shelves of books. The air was cool and smelled of old paper and dust. Moonlight streamed through a tall, arched window, silvering the room in a pale, ethereal glow. Sorellen was standing by that window, his back to her, a tall, dark silhouette against the starry sky. He did not turn as she entered. She set the silver pitcher and a single goblet on a small table, her hands trembling slightly. The sound of the metal on the wood seemed deafeningly loud in the quiet room. She had done her duty. She should leave. But she waited. After a long moment, he turned. In the dim light, his face was all shadows and angles. His eyes, which had seemed so dark in the torchlight of the hall, now held the soft, reflected light of the moon. He looked at her, and the silence in the room was no longer the empty, oppressive silence of the court. It was a different kind of quiet, attentive, expectant, a space waiting to be filled. He took a step toward her, then hesitated. His hands, which had been clasped behind his back, came forward. He lifted one, holding it in the space between them. He looked from his hand to her face, a question clear in his eyes. Was it real? Did I imagine it? Ilara's fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now joined by a surge of empathy that was stronger. She was no longer just a servant in the presence of a prince. She was a person who held a key, standing before a man who had been locked in a tower of silence his entire life. Slowly, deliberately, she lifted her own hand. She repeated the sign. Thumb circling her chest. Are you all right? A breath shuddered out of him, a sound so soft it was almost lost in the stillness. It was the first sound she had ever heard him make. He closed his eyes for a second, as if in pain or profound relief. When he opened them, the last of his princely composure had fallen away. He looked young, and lost, and desperately hopeful. He raised his own hands. They were elegant, long-fingered hands, but they moved with a hesitant uncertainty, like a limb that had long been asleep. He fumbled through the shape of a sign, his brow furrowed in concentration. It was a clumsy, unpracticed gesture. He brought his flattened hand to his chin and moved it forward. The sign for thank you. Then, his fingers shifted, forming a new shape, a question he had probably been waiting his whole life to ask someone. His index finger pointed at her, then he crooked it into a question mark. His other hand formed a W, tapping it against his chin. Who are you? Ilara felt a smile touch her lips, the first genuine smile she'd felt all night. It felt as risky and as revolutionary as her first sign. She set down her tray and gave him her answer. Her fingers moved with the familiar, fluid grace Leo had taught her. She spelled her name, letter by letter. Elara. His eyes followed the movement of her hands, his focus absolute. He mirrored the motions with his own hands, mouthing her name silently. Ilara. The name hung in the air between them, a bridge built of silence, connecting two solitudes across a vast and dangerous divide. The real conversation had just begun. Their meetings became a clandestine ritual, a secret language spoken in the quiet interstices of courtly life. They could not risk the prince's chambers again, it was too conspicuous. Instead, they found other places, other moments. A shadowed alcove in the armory where Ilara delivered linens. A brief, charged minute in the echoing corridors behind the kitchens as she carried a tray of bread. The deserted upper balconies of the great hall, late at night, when the court had retired and only the moon stood witness. In these stolen moments, a world unfolded. Sorellen was a desperate and brilliant student. He absorbed the signs she taught him with a fierce, hungry intelligence. He had spent his life observing, listening with his eyes, and his mind was a vast, untapped reservoir of thoughts and ideas that now had a channel through which to flow. At first, his hands were clumsy, his signs hesitant and rough. But with each passing day, they grew more fluid, more articulate. The language lived in him, and she was merely waking it up. He learned to ask questions. What is that flower called? Why does Lord Valerus watch my father that way? What is it like to live in the village beyond the castle walls? His curiosity was boundless, insatiable. He had been a spectator to his own life for so long, and now he wanted to understand its mechanics, its textures, its truths. Ilara, in turn, became his teacher and his student. She taught him the signs for hundreds of words, for complex emotions, for abstract concepts. She taught him the rhythm and grammar of a language that was as nuanced and beautiful as any spoken tongue. And he, in return, taught her how to see his world. He would lead her to a tapestry and, with his hands, tell her the story woven into its threads, a forgotten battle, a lost queen, a piece of the kingdom's history that had been glossed over in the official chronicles. He would point out the subtle shifts in the king's posture that betrayed his moods, the way a certain courtier's smile never reached his eyes. He taught her the silent language of his father's court, a language he had mastered through a lifetime of observation. One evening, they met in the royal library, a place so vast and seldom used that they were guaranteed solitude. Dust motes danced in the shafts of moonlight that pierced the high, cathedral-like windows. The air smelled of aged parchment and leather. Sorellen was tracing the spine of a book with one finger, his expression thoughtful. He turned to her, his movements slow. "Why?" he signed, his index finger tapping his temple. "Why do you know this language?" It was a question she had been expecting, and dreading. To answer it was to offer a piece of herself, to make herself vulnerable in a place where vulnerability was a death sentence. But his eyes, dark and patient, held no judgment, only a quiet desire to understand. She owed him the truth. She took a breath and began to sign, her hands moving through the sad, familiar story. "I had a brother. His name was Leo. He was born deaf." This was his voice. She described Leo's bright, curious mind, his frustration with a world that wouldn't listen, his joy in the language they had built together. She told Sorellen how the other children had shunned him, how the village elders had pitied him, seeing him as broken. And she told him how Leo had died 3 years ago, from a fever that had swept through the village, leaving her with a language and no one to speak it with. "Until now," she finished, her hands falling to her sides. Sorellen stood perfectly still, absorbing her story. The silence in the library felt different now, heavier, filled with the weight of her grief. He stepped closer, his gaze soft with an empathy she had never seen on another's face. He had not known her brother, but he knew the loneliness she spoke of. It was the country where he had lived his entire life. He raised his hands slowly. "My silence," he began, his fingers forming the signs with a new, somber precision. "It is not from birth." Ilara's eyes widened. This was a secret she had never imagined. The entire kingdom believed the prince's muteness was a congenital flaw. "When I was a child," he continued, his hands painting a story in the dusty air, "there was a disagreement. A challenge to my father's rule. A faction from the southern provinces, led by a powerful sorcerer. He described a night of fire and fear, a raid on the castle itself. He had been only 5 years old. The sorcerer had breached the royal nursery. He did not want to kill me," Sorellen signed, a shadow passing over his face. "He wanted to wound my father. To create a symbol of his weakness. A broken heir." He touched his throat with his fingertips. "He took my voice. He locked it away with a curse. He said it would only be returned if the bloodline of the king was ended. A self-sacrificing curse. His silence protected his father's life." Ilara stared at him, her heart aching. It was not a flaw. It was a sacrifice. A burden he had carried in silence, alone, for nearly 2 decades. The court's disdain, his father's subtle disappointment, he had endured it all, knowing a truth that would have reframed him not as a failure, but as a hero. "Does your father know?" she signed, her hands trembling. Sorellen's expression was bleak. "He knows of the curse. He does not know how to break it without." He gestured with his hand, a sharp, cutting motion. "Ending himself." His gaze was filled with a profound, ancient sorrow. "So he pretends. We both pretend. It is easier for him to see me as flawed than to see me as a daily reminder of his own mortality." In that moment, the last of the distance between them dissolved. She was not a serving girl and he was not a prince. They were 2 people, bound by the shared experience of being misunderstood, of carrying a silent weight the world could not see. He had given her his deepest secret, a truth that could shatter the foundations of the onyx throne. He had trusted her. She reached out, an instinctive gesture, and laid her hand gently on his arm. The fine wool of his tunic was soft beneath her fingers. It was a shocking breach of every protocol, a touch that could have her executed. But it felt like the most natural thing in the world. He did not pull away. He simply stood there, allowing the contact, his eyes closing for a brief second. For the first time, perhaps in his entire life, his secret was shared. He was not entirely alone in his silence. And in the vast, dusty library, under the watchful gaze of a million forgotten stories, their fragile, dangerous connection deepened into something true and unbreakable. The change in Prince Sorellen, subtle at first, began to ripple outward. It was nothing overt, nothing the court could easily pinpoint, but it was there. A new light in his eyes, a confidence in his posture that had not existed before. He no longer seemed to be fading into the tapestries. He met the gazes of the courtiers who ignored him, his stare level and unnervingly direct, forcing them to be the first to look away. His presence began to take up space, to have weight. He was still silent, but he was no longer absent. And people began to notice. Lord Valerus was the first. His ambition had honed his senses to the slightest shifts in the currents of power. He observed the prince with a renewed, predatory interest. His gaze, sharp as obsidian shards, would often sweep the hall, lingering on Sorellen, then moving on, cataloguing the servants. Ilara felt his eyes on her more and more frequently. It was a cold, calculating scrutiny that made the hairs on her arms stand up. He was looking for the source of the change, the variable in the equation. One afternoon, Ilara was crossing the main courtyard, a basket of fresh linens in her arms. The sun was weak, casting long, skeletal shadows from the castle's spires. She was preoccupied, replaying in her mind the new signs Sorellen had taught her the night before, signs for complex political concepts like allegiance and betrayal. "You there, girl." The voice, silken and cold, stopped her in her tracks. Lord Valerus emerged from the shadow of a colonnade, his movements unnaturally fluid. He was smiling, but it was a carnivore's smile, all teeth and no warmth. "You are one of the servers in the great hall, are you not?" he asked, his eyes roaming over her, dismissive yet intensely focused. "I am, my lord," Ilara said, her voice small. She curtsied, keeping her eyes respectfully lowered, her heart beginning a low, fearful thrum. "I have noticed you," he continued, circling her slowly, like a wolf assessing its prey. "You are efficient. Quiet. Almost invisible." He paused directly in front of her. "Almost." Ilara's blood ran cold. "The prince," Valerus said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "He has brightened of late. Found a new spirit, one might say. It is a remarkable transformation. One wonders at its cause." He leaned closer, his scent a cloying mix of expensive cologne and something ancient, like dust from a tomb. "Have you noticed this change, girl?" "The prince's disposition is not my place to comment on, my lord," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the cobblestones. Valerus chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Of course not. Your place is to be invisible. And yet, I see him watch you. When you clear the plates, when you pour the wine. His eyes follow you. A prince, heir to the throne, and a serving girl," he tutted softly. "A dangerous story, wouldn't you agree?" Ilara said nothing, her knuckles white where she gripped the basket. He knew. He didn't know how, he didn't know the specifics, but he had sensed their connection. He saw it as a lever, a weakness to be exploited. "Be careful," Valerus hissed, his voice losing its playful edge and taking on a sharp, menacing tone. "Secrets in this castle have a way of coming to light. And the king does not suffer threats to the royal bloodline gladly. Especially not from common dirt." With a final, contemptuous look, he swept away, his black cloak melting back into the shadows. Ilara stood frozen in the middle of the courtyard, the basket of linens suddenly feeling impossibly heavy. The air, which had felt cool and crisp, now felt suffocating. She was no longer just a ghost in the castle's halls. She had been seen. And the one who had seen her was a man who would not hesitate to destroy her to further his own ends. The threat changed everything. Their secret meetings were now fraught with a new, palpable tension. Every shadow could hold a spy. Every quiet corridor could be an ambush. Ilara's fear was a constant, bitter taste in her mouth. She thought about stopping, about severing the connection with Sorellen to protect them both. It would be the sensible, safe thing to do. She tried. For 2 days, she avoided the library, the deserted balconies, the hidden alcoves. She performed her duties in the great hall with her eyes fixed firmly on the floor, refusing to even glance in the direction of the high table. It was a miserable, hollow existence. The hall was once again just a cavern of predators, and the silence was once again empty. She felt the prince's gaze on her, questioning, hurt, but she could not bring herself to meet it. On the third night, as she was leaving the kitchens, a hand shot out from a darkened doorway and pulled her into a small pantry. She gave a startled cry, which was muffled by a hand gently placed over her mouth. "It is only me," a voice whispered. Her eyes adjusted to the gloom. It was Gareth, one of the prince's personal guards, a man known for his loyalty and discretion. He removed his hand. "The prince is worried," Gareth said, his voice a low rumble. "He has been agitated. He asks that you meet him in the old rookery at midnight." "I can't," Elara whispered, her voice shaking. "We are being watched." "Lord Valerus." "We know," Gareth interrupted. "That is why you must come. The prince has something he needs to tell you." The rookery was at the top of the highest, most ancient tower of the castle, long abandoned by the ravens it was built for. The climb up the winding stone staircase left her breathless. The air grew colder, thinner. At the top, a heavy wooden door opened onto a circular stone chamber, open to the night sky. The wind howled through the empty archways, a lonely, mournful sound. Sorellen was waiting for her, standing in the center of the room, the moonlight turning his dark hair to silver. The wind whipped at his cloak, making him look like a figure from a legend. His face was grim. "You were right to be afraid," he signed as soon as she was near, his hands moving with sharp, urgent precision. "Valerus spoke to my father." Ilara's heart stopped. "What did he say?" "He spoke of inappropriate influences. He suggested a servant girl was filling my head with ideas, ambitions." Sorellen's hands tightened into fists. "He is trying to poison my father's mind against me. Against you. He wants to isolate me again." He looked at her, his eyes dark with a mixture of anger and despair. "He sees our connection as a weapon he can use. To prove I am weak, unstable. To position himself as a more suitable advisor to the throne." The sheer, calculated cruelty of it stole her breath. Valerus wasn't just trying to get her in trouble, he was using their bond to undermine Sorellen's position, to paint his newfound voice as a sign of madness, of being manipulated by a commoner. "What will we do?" she signed, her fear now a cold, hard knot of dread. Sorellen looked out at the sprawling kingdom below, a tapestry of sleeping towns and dark forests under the moon. For a long moment, he was still. When he turned back to her, the despair in his eyes had been replaced by a hard, defiant resolve. "We will not hide," he signed, his gestures firm, decisive. "Hiding is what he wants. It proves his point. It makes us look guilty." He took a step closer, his gaze intense. "We will not give him that power. We will be careful. But we will not be silenced." He reached out and, for the second time, he touched her. This time it was not a hesitant, questioning gesture. His fingers gently cupped her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin. The touch was warm against the cold night air. It was a promise. A declaration. "I will not lose you," his eyes said, more clearly than any sign. "I will not be alone again." In that high, windswept tower, surrounded by the ghosts of forgotten birds and the vast, indifferent night, Elara made her choice. She would not run. She would not hide. She had helped this man find his voice. She would not be the reason he was forced to lose it again. She leaned into his touch, a silent pledge of her own, and together they faced the howling wind, ready for the storm to come. The king summoned her 6 days later. The summons did not come through a nervous page or a discreet guard. It was delivered by the seneschal himself, a creature so ancient his skin resembled dried parchment stretched over a frame of brittle twigs. He appeared before her as she polished silver in the scullery, his presence sucking the warmth from the room. He did not speak her name. He simply said, "The king will see you now," and turned, expecting her to follow. The walk to the king's private study was the longest of her life. Each footstep on the cold stone floors echoed like a hammer blow against an anvil. The guards they passed seemed to stare through her, their faces impassive, but she felt their judgment, their contempt. She was the common dirt Valerus had spoken of, being dragged before the sun. The study was a room built for power. The walls were lined not with books, but with maps of the kingdom, each dotted with markers for garrisons and patrols. A fire crackled in a hearth large enough to roast an ox, its light glinting off the weapons mounted on the walls, ancient swords, cruel-looking axes, and a single, elegant war hammer resting on a velvet stand. King Theron sat behind a massive desk carved from the heart of a petrified oak, his hands steepled before him. He did not look up as she entered. He was examining a piece of parchment, and the silence he allowed to stretch was a weapon in itself, designed to unnerve and intimidate. Ilara stood in the center of the room, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She kept her eyes downcast, focusing on the intricate patterns of the woven rug beneath her feet. She could hear the scratch of the king's quill, the hiss and pop of the fire, the frantic beating of her own heart. Finally, he set the quill down. "Lord Valerus," the king began, his voice a low, dangerous baritone, "tells me you have taken a special interest in my son." He still hadn't looked at her. He was speaking to the room, to the air, as if she were merely an incidental piece of furniture. "My lord," Ilara began, her voice a reedy whisper. "Look at me when you speak," he commanded. The order was not loud, but it had the force of a physical blow. Slowly, Ilara raised her head and met the king's eyes. They were the same midnight color as his son's, but they held none of Sorellen's gentleness. They were cold, ancient, and utterly ruthless. They were the eyes of a monarch who had held his throne for centuries through strength and brutality, and they were dissecting her, stripping away her defenses, searching for the lie. "Lord Valerus is a man of ambition," the king continued, his gaze unwavering. "He sees conspiracies in every shadow. He suggests you are whispering sedition into my son's ear. He implies you are a spy, sent by our enemies to exploit a perceived weakness." He paused, letting the accusation hang in the air like smoke. "Tell me, girl, are you a spy?" "No, your majesty," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "I am not." "Then what are you?" he pressed, leaning forward slightly. The movement was minimal, but it made the vast desk seem to shrink, the room to close in around her. "What is your purpose with the prince? Do you seek wealth? A title? Do you imagine that by gaining the confidence of a damaged boy, you can elevate your own station?" The insult to Sorellen, the casual cruelty of the word damaged, sent a spike of anger through her fear. It was this dismissal, this blindness, that had caused Sorellen so much pain. It was the poison that had filled the halls of this castle for years. "No, your majesty," she said, her voice finding a new strength. "I seek nothing." "You seek nothing?" The king raised a skeptical eyebrow. "No one does anything for nothing. Not in my court." "I gave him what anyone deserves," Ilara said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "A way to be heard." For the first time, a flicker of something other than cold authority appeared in the king's eyes. It might have been surprise. "Heard? Your son is not damaged," she said, her courage fueled by her indignation. "He is intelligent, and observant, and kind. He has a mind that sees everything. But he has been trapped. Alone. For 20 years. She took a breath, knowing she was crossing a line from which there was no return. "I taught him a language. The one my brother used. A language of the hands. It is all I have done. I gave him words. The thoughts, the ideas, the ambitions Lord Valerus fears, they were already his. They were just waiting for a way out." The king stared at her, his face an unreadable mask of stone. The fire crackled. The silence returned, heavier than before, thick with unspoken possibilities. He could have her executed for her impertinence. He could have her thrown in the dungeons for daring to presume she knew his son better than he did. He rose from his chair. He was taller than she had realized, a truly imposing figure who dwarfed the massive furniture around him. He walked around the desk and stopped a few feet in front of her. He looked down at her, his shadow falling over her like a shroud. "Show me," he said, his voice quiet. Ilara blinked. "Your Majesty." "The language," he clarified, his eyes boring into hers. "Show me a word." Her mind went blank with panic. What word could she possibly choose? What sign could she make for this terrifying, unmovable man? Then, she thought of Sorellen. She thought of his sacrifice, the secret he carried to protect this man, his father. Slowly, she raised her hands. She made a fist and pressed it to the center of her chest, over her heart. A simple, powerful sign. One of the first she had ever taught Sorellen. Son. The king's eyes flickered down to her hands, then back to her face. He did not speak. He did not move. But she saw it. A subtle, almost imperceptible softening of the hard line of his mouth. A deep, ancient sadness that surfaced for a barest second in the depths of his eyes before being ruthlessly suppressed. He had understood. He had seen not just the sign, but the meaning behind it, the connection it represented. He turned his back on her and walked to the fire, staring into the flames. "You will continue to serve in the great hall," he said, his voice rough. "You will not speak of this to anyone. Your lessons with the prince will cease." Ilara's heart plummeted. It was over. He was separating them. Instead, the king continued, still facing the fire, "You will attend him in the royal library. Every evening. For 1 hour." As his official tutor he turned his head slightly, fixing her with a look of stern warning. "Lord Valerus will be informed that I have assigned you this duty personally, to assist the prince with his studies of ancient texts. It is a mundane, scholarly task. Nothing more. Do you understand?" She understood perfectly. It was not a punishment. It was a protection. By giving her an official, sanctioned role, he was shielding her from Valerus's accusations. He was legitimizing her presence in Sorellen's life, hiding their secret in plain sight. He was, in his own cold, calculating way, giving them his blessing. "Yes, Your Majesty," she whispered, a wave of dizzying relief washing over her. "I understand." "Good," he said, turning back to the fire. "Now get out." Ilara curtsied deeply and backed out of the room, her legs shaking. She had walked into the lion's den and emerged not only unscathed, but with the lion's reluctant protection. As the heavy oak door closed behind her, she leaned against the cold stone of the corridor wall and drew her first easy breath in days. The king had not admitted his feelings, had not acknowledged the truth of his son's lonely existence. But he had acted. He had seen the truth in her words, and in a gesture more powerful than any apology, he had chosen to help. The ground beneath their feet had shifted. Their small, silent rebellion was no longer entirely a secret. The royal library became their sanctuary. Within its walls, under the king's tacit protection, they were free. The fear of being discovered was replaced by the quiet joy of shared discovery. Their hour each evening was a world unto itself, a space carved out of the castle's oppressive reality where they could simply be Ilara and Sorellen. Their conversations deepened, ranging from the history of the kingdom to the philosophies of the ancient texts that surrounded them. Ilara found that Sorellen possessed a brilliant strategic mind, one that saw patterns and possibilities the way a master weaver saw a tapestry. He would lay out maps on the great reading table and, with his hands, deconstruct famous battles, showing her how a different choice, a slight shift in troop movement, could have changed the course of history. He spoke of politics not with the cynical ambition of Valerus, but with a genuine concern for the kingdom's people, a perspective gained from a lifetime of silent observation from the margins. He, in turn, was fascinated by her life. He wanted to know everything about the world beyond the castle gates. She described the scent of rain on summer dust, the taste of fresh-baked bread from the village ovens, the sound of the market on a festival day. She told him stories of Leo, of their childhood games, of the small, ordinary happinesses that had made up her life. Through her hands, she gave him a world he had never known. One evening, a delegation from the Sunstone Confederacy, a powerful and notoriously fickle neighboring kingdom, was announced. They were arriving in a fortnight to finalize a crucial trade treaty, one that the kingdom desperately needed to secure its southern border and replenish its coffers after a long, hard winter. The court was immediately abuzz with preparations. Tensions ran high. The Sunstone lords were known for their arrogance and their shrewd, often deceptive, negotiating tactics. As the day of their arrival grew closer, a subtle change came over Sorellen. A darkness entered his eyes, a troubled tension that even their time in the library could not erase. He grew distracted, his signs sometimes faltering mid-thought. One night, as they sat across from each other at the heavy oak table, Ilara finally asked him, "What is wrong? You seem distant." He stared at the map of the southern provinces spread between them, his jaw tight. He hesitated, then his hands began to move, slowly, as if the words themselves were heavy. The Sunstone Confederacy, he signed. Their leader, the one who negotiated the first draft of this treaty, his name is Lord Kalen. He spelled the name out, his fingers sharp and precise. It is a common name. But the man who cursed me, the sorcerer, that was his name, too. A chill went down Ilara's spine. You think it could be the same person? It was 20 years ago, Sorellen replied, his gaze still fixed on the map. I was a child. I only saw his face for a moment. But I remember his eyes. And I remember the sigil on his ring. He held up his hand, tracing a shape in the air with his index finger, a serpent eating its own tail, but with a jagged lightning bolt through the center. I have seen that sigil in the diplomatic correspondence. On the wax seal of the treaty draft. Ilara felt the blood drain from her face. You must tell your father, she said aloud, forgetting to sign in her alarm. Sorellen looked at her, his expression grim. And say what? That I have a vague memory from 2 decades ago? That a powerful ally, a man who holds the key to our kingdom's prosperity, might be the same man who attacked the castle? My father would see it as a child's fantasy. A delusion. Valerus would use it as proof of my instability. He was right. Without concrete proof, it was just the word of the mute prince, whose mind was already considered suspect by many at court. The king, a pragmatist above all else, would never risk insulting a powerful foreign lord based on a 20-year-old trauma. He will be here, Sorellen signed, his hands trembling slightly. In the Great Hall. I will see his face again. Then I will know. The night the delegation arrived, the Great Hall was transformed. It glittered with extra candlelight, the tables groaned under the weight of the most lavish feast Ilara had ever seen, and the court was dressed in its finest silks and velvets. The air was thick with forced pleasantries and the sharp, metallic tang of political tension. Ilara moved through her duties in a fog of anxiety. Her eyes kept darting to the high table, where the Sunstone Lords sat with the king. Their leader, Lord Kalen, was a striking man with silver hair and eyes the color of pale jade. He was charming, his voice a smooth, cultured purr as he exchanged pleasantries with King Theron. He looked nothing like the shadowy villain of a child's nightmare. Ilara felt a sliver of hope. Perhaps Sorellen had been mistaken. Then she looked at the prince. He sat beside his father, as still and silent as ever, but his stillness was different tonight. It was the rigid stillness of a man bracing for a blow. His face was pale, his eyes fixed on Lord Kalen with an intensity that was almost painful to watch. The feast progressed. Toasts were made. The initial terms of the treaty were read aloud by the seneschal, full of promises of mutual prosperity and enduring friendship. Lord Kalen smiled, King Theron nodded, and the court murmured its approval. Everything was proceeding smoothly. Too smoothly. Ilara was refilling a goblet near the high table when Lord Kalen laughed at something the king said. As he laughed, he leaned back in his chair and gestured with his hand, a fine, jeweled ring on his finger catching the candlelight. Ilara saw it. A serpent, eating its own tail, with a lightning bolt struck through its center. Her breath caught in her throat. She looked at Sorellen. He had seen it too. His eyes met hers across the crowded table, and in them, she saw not just recognition, but pure, cold terror. He knew. It was him. The man who had stolen his voice was sitting at his father's right hand, being feted as an honored guest. And the treaty he was about to sign was not a pact of friendship. It was a dagger aimed at the kingdom's heart. The realization struck them both in the same, terrible instant. This was not just about trade. This was the culmination of a 20-year-old plan. The sorcerer had not been defeated, he had simply retreated, changed his name, and amassed power, waiting for the perfect moment to finish what he had started. The treaty was a trap. Sorellen's hands, hidden beneath the table, began to move in a flurry of desperate signs, visible only to Ilara. The treaty, it grants them access to our southern garrisons. 4 joint patrols. He will use it to stage his troops inside our borders. It's an invasion. A coup. Ilara's mind raced. How could they warn the king? Sorellen couldn't speak. If he tried to cause a scene, to gesture frantically, he would be dismissed as having one of his fits. Werewolves would ensure it. The final parchment was brought forward, the one that would seal the agreement. A quill was dipped in ink and handed to King Theron. Lord Kaelin watched, his jade-green eyes glittering with triumph, his charming smile a predatory mask. Sorellen looked at his father, then at the smiling traitor beside him. A look of pure desperation crossed his face. He pushed his chair back slightly, the sound a harsh scrape that drew a few irritated glances. He opened his mouth, as if by sheer force of will he could make a sound, any sound. But only silence came out. His father shot him a look, a sharp, silencing glare that said, "Not now." The king was lifting the quill. Sorellen's eyes locked with Ilara's. It was a silent, desperate plea. He was out of time. He was voiceless. He needed her. In that moment, she knew she could no longer be a ghost. She could no longer hide in the shadows. The safety she had clung to for so long was an illusion. The only real thing in the room was the bond she shared with the silent prince, and the terrible truth only they knew. King Theron's quill hovered an inch above the parchment. The entire hall held its breath. The future of the kingdom was balanced on that tiny, ink-stained point. Ilara took a step forward. And then another. She moved from the shadows along the wall into the open space behind the high table. Every rule she had ever lived by screamed at her to stop, but the desperate plea in Sorellen's eyes propelled her forward. "My king," she said. Her voice, though not loud, cut through the expectant silence like a shard of glass. Every head at the high table turned toward her. A collective gasp rippled through the courtiers. A serving girl, interrupting a state signing. It was unthinkable. King Theron's eyes narrowed into slits of pure fury. Lord Valerus's lips curled into a triumphant sneer. The common girl was finally destroying herself. "What is the meaning of this?" The king's voice boomed, echoing in the cavernous hall. "Have you lost your mind?" "Forgive me, your majesty," Ilara said, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it might break. She did not look at the king. She looked at Sorellen. "But the prince has something to say." She turned her body slightly, so she was facing both the prince and the assembled lords. She held her hands up in the space between them, ready. It was a public declaration of her role, of their connection. It was the most dangerous gamble of her life. Sorellen stared at her for a fraction of a second, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe at her courage. Then, understanding dawned. He would not be dismissed. She would not let him be. She was offering to be his voice, here, now, in front of everyone. He straightened in his chair, the years of slumped resignation falling away from him like a discarded cloak. He looked directly at his father, and for the first time, there was not a trace of fear in his gaze. There was only the fierce, burning intensity of a prince about to save his kingdom. His hands rose. They began to move. They flew with a speed and precision Ilara had never seen before. It was a torrent of language, a flood of information held back for 2 decades and now released in a desperate, silent rush. He signed of the sorcerer, of the attack, of the curse that had stolen his voice to protect the king's life. He signed of the sigil on the ring, the serpent with the lightning bolt. He pointed a trembling finger directly at the guest of honor. "He is not Lord Kaelin," Ilara translated, her voice ringing with conviction, matching the fury in Sorellen's gestures. "He is the sorcerer Kaelin who attacked this castle 20 years ago. The man who cursed me." A wave of shock and disbelief washed over the court. Lord Kaelin, the sorcerer, laughed, a sound of pure, arrogant dismissal. "Your Majesty, surely you will not listen to this. This circus. The ravings of a broken boy and his pet servant." But the king was not looking at him. His eyes were fixed on his son. He was seeing him, truly seeing him, for the first time. He saw not a damaged boy, but a man, his heir, communicating with a passion and clarity that transcended sound. The memory of the attack, the long-suppressed guilt and grief, was dawning on his face. Sorellen's hands did not stop. "The treaty." He signed, his movements sharp, frantic. "It is a lie. A Trojan horse. He will use the joint patrols to move his army into our southern fortresses." Ilara's voice rose, carrying his silent words to every corner of the hall. It is not a treaty, it is an invasion plan. He is here to finish what he started, to take the onyx throne. The accusation, so specific, so strategically sound, hung in the air, undeniable. It was not a child's fantasy. It was a military assessment. The sorcerer's mask of charm finally shattered. His face twisted into a snarl of pure hatred. "You should have stayed silent, boy," he hissed, and his hand flew, not for a sword, but to the folds of his cloak. But King Theron was faster. In a blur of motion that belied his age, he overturned the massive table, sending plates, goblets, and the treacherous treaty crashing to the floor. "Guards," he roared, his voice the thunder of a breaking storm. "Seize him." The royal guard, who had been standing frozen in shock, surged forward. The other Sunstone lords, caught completely off guard, scrambled for their weapons. The great hall exploded into chaos. The sorcerer uttered a word of arcane power, and a blast of black energy erupted from his hand, sending the first two guards flying. He lunged not for the king, but for Sorellen. He was the one who had ruined everything. But Sorellen, who had spent a lifetime observing, anticipated the move. He threw himself backward, his chair toppling over, and the sorcerer's magical dagger, formed of solidified shadow, sliced through the air where his throat had been a second before. Elara screamed as two of the Sunstone lords grabbed her, their iron grips bruising her arms. In the center of the room, the king, his face a mask of cold fury, hefted the war hammer from its display on the wall. The ancient weapon hummed with power in his hand. He moved with the deadly grace of a seasoned warrior, his regal robes no impediment. He met the sorcerer's attack head-on, magical energy clashing against enchanted steel. The battle was short and brutal. The royal guard, loyal and disciplined, quickly subdued the panicked Sunstone delegation. King Theron, fighting with the righteous fury of a father defending his son, shattered the sorcerer's magical wards with a swing of his hammer and brought him to his knees. The chaos subsided as quickly as it had begun. The great hall was a wreck of overturned furniture and scattered food. The Sunstone lords were held at sword point, their faces a mixture of fear and disbelief. The sorcerer Kaelin, disarmed and bleeding, was forced to the ground before the onyx throne. And in the relative quiet that followed, all eyes turned to the two figures who had started it all. Elara, freed from her captors, was breathing heavily, her whole body trembling. And Sorellen was slowly getting to his feet, his gaze locked on his father. The king stood over his defeated enemy, the war hammer still humming in his hand. He looked from the snarling sorcerer on the floor to his son. He saw the intelligence in Sorellen's eyes, the courage he had just displayed, the truth he had carried alone for 20 years. The full weight of his failure as a father, of his willful blindness, crashed down on him. He dropped the hammer, its clang echoing through the silent hall. He took a step toward his son, then another. He stopped in front of him, and the court watched, breathless. The great, unmovable King Theron looked vulnerable for the first time in centuries. You carried this. For me," the king said, his voice rough with an emotion no one had ever heard from him before. "It was awe. It was regret." Sorellen looked at his father. He did not sign. He simply nodded. The king reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and placed it on Sorellen's shoulder. "I am sorry," he said, the words a raw, painful confession. "I did not see. I am sorry." He then turned his gaze to Elara. The fury was gone, replaced by a deep, weary respect. "And you," he said. "You gave him back his voice." He looked from Elara to his son, and finally, he understood. He saw the unbreakable bond that had saved them all. "You gave him back to me." The aftermath was a quiet storm. The sorcerer Kaelin and his co-conspirators were dragged to the dungeons, their plot unraveled, their threat extinguished. The great hall was slowly restored to order, but the atmosphere within the castle had been irrevocably changed. The old, oppressive silence had been shattered, replaced by a new, uncertain quiet filled with whispers of the night's events. The mute prince was no longer a symbol of shame, he was the hero of the hour, the silent savior of the throne. In the hours after the battle, King Theron did not leave his son's side. For the first time, father and son sat together in the king's study, not in their customary stiff silence, but in a state of active communication. With Alara acting as their bridge, Sorellen finally told his father everything. He spoke of the long, lonely years, of the frustration, of the burden of his secret. The king listened, his face etched with a grief and regret that seemed to carve new lines into his ancient features. It was a painful, necessary conversation, a healing that was 20 years overdue. By the time the first rays of dawn painted the sky in hues of grey and rose, a new understanding had been forged between them. Sorellen was no longer just the heir, he was the king's most trusted advisor, his strategic mind finally recognized and valued. Alara, exhausted but safe, was given chambers in the royal wing, a silent acknowledgement of her new, unclassifiable status. She was no longer a servant, but she was not royalty. She was something new, something essential. She was the prince's voice. A few days later, Sorellen sought her out. He found her in the royal gardens, a place she had only ever seen from a distance. The air was cool and sweet with the scent of night-blooming moonflower. She was standing by a fountain, the gentle sound of trickling water a soothing balm after the chaos. He came to stand beside her, the moonlight soft on his face. For a long while, they simply stood in comfortable silence, watching the stars appear in the deepening twilight. Finally, he raised his hands. "I never thanked you," he signed. Alara smiled softly. "You did. In the library. It was the first thing you ever said to me." "No," he corrected, his expression serious. "I thanked you for a kindness. I want to thank you for my life. Not just for saving it in the hall, but for giving it back to me, piece by piece, every day in the library." He paused, his gaze searching hers. "Before you, I was a ghost. I existed, but I was not alive. You saw me. No one else ever tried." The sincerity in his eyes, the depth of his gratitude, was overwhelming. She felt a warmth spread through her chest, a quiet, profound joy that eclipsed all the fear she had endured. "We saw each other," she signed back, her hands moving with a gentle grace. "I was a ghost, too. Hiding. Afraid. You made me brave." He reached out and took her hands in his grip warm and steady. It was a simple, profound gesture of connection. He looked down at their joined hands, then back up at her, a small, genuine smile gracing his lips. It was the first time she had ever seen him truly smile, and it transformed his entire face, chasing away the last of the shadows. "My father has found a way," he signed, his eyes bright with a hope she had never seen in them before. The sorcerer's curse was tied to his life. With his execution, the magic is unbound. The court mags believe, they believe the curse can be broken. Ilara's breath hitched. The possibility was staggering. For him to be able to speak, to laugh, to call her name aloud. It was a future she had never dared to imagine. "Will you want to?" she signed, a sudden, quiet fear fluttering in her heart. If he had his voice back, a spoken voice, would he still need this silent language? Would he still need her? Sorellen seemed to understand the unspoken question in her eyes. He squeezed her hands gently. His expression softened into one of absolute certainty, of unwavering tenderness. "This," he signed, gesturing to their hands, to the space between them, to the silent language they shared. "This will always be our language. This is how I first told you my name. This is how you told me about your brother. This is how I told you my deepest secret." He met her gaze, his own eyes shining with emotion. "Even if I regain my speech, this will always be the language of my heart. It is the language that you taught me." He let go of one of her hands and raised his own. He spelled her name, Elara, just as he had that first night in his chambers. Then he followed it with 3 simple, powerful signs. A pointed finger. A fist over his heart. And his hands crossing over his chest, as if in an embrace. "You are my heart." Tears welled in Ilara's eyes, but they were tears of joy. In this quiet garden, under the watchful eyes of the stars, the last of her loneliness melted away. She was no longer a ghost, and he was no longer a silent prince. They were 2 people who had found each other across a chasm of silence and built a new world together, a world where being seen and being